First site that I really came across was a place called Wired.com, which at the time, I think the editor of Wired, Chris Anderson, had just visited New Zealand, and so of course it was in the news. So you go there, and right in the top right-hand corner was a site called Hotwired, which is where they dealt with all the stuff that wasn't specifically related to technology and the internet, but all of the kind of stuff that people who lived in places like San Francisco and Seattle were supposed to be interested in. And there was a small site there called Hotwired Cocktails, and that was a guy called Paul Harrington. He's no longer a bartender. But it was a site where he was delving in week by week. There'd be a brand new cocktail, and it just turned me on to the world of all of these classic drinks. So before then, I never really knew that you could have a margarita and it wouldn't have to come out of a blender, that there was a classic traditional way to make it, or that the great cocktails that you were supposed to know were the Manhattan and the Martini and the Mojito. And of course, so I'd trot off with my flatmate and our backgammon board, and we'd go down to the Matterhorn, which had just opened in Cuba Street, and try and test them with half of these classic cocktails that we were getting off the internet. And it probably helped them in some way, although I'm sure at the time they thought I was a pretentious little shit. Eventually they hired me. But also what it really did was one of the things, I guess the biggest way to explain the difference is a lot of what was happening in this cocktail world was actually they were just going to second-hand stores and finding the cocktail books from the 1930s and 20s, and even as far back as 1862, the first printed cocktail book. And so but in New Zealand we just had none of that, because we'd come so close to Prohibition, and then we'd had the 6 o'clock swill, and the cocktail books that had been published after the end of 6 o'clock closing were usually guys with sort of big hair making drinks with cream and creme de menthe, and they were sort of like failed lounge singers. Like what would Liberace do if he lived in Papatoetoe? He'd work at the Terraces bar and make blended pina coladas. So we didn't have this kind of world of classic cocktail books that we could go to every thrift store or second-hand store and find. And whereas in the United States, particularly in California and New York, there were all these books. But what the internet did was it meant that we were suddenly only a month behind the guy who had just gone to a second-hand store in Brooklyn and found a copy of the first cocktail book published in 1862 and had started putting them up online. So it meant that the only gap between us and the reading of that book was the time that it had taken for him to scan it and enter the text online. And so it suddenly made us not just closer to places like New York and London, where the real kind of trends in cocktail were happening, but it also shrunk time, in the sense that I probably know as much about this guy from 1862, a bartender who's long dead and buried in an almost unmarked grave in Brooklyn, as I do about Rob Muldoon and David Longy. And I say that with some assurance because I studied politics, so it's not like I know nothing about them. But I guess it shrunk time and it shrunk the world, and what it's enabled us to do is almost recreate the golden age of cocktails. But it meant that once upon a time the golden age of cocktails had to be somewhere close to ice and close to the population, and somewhere that were usually on the Atlantic, because that's where all the products were coming from now. But thanks to the internet, we can make all of these forgotten products, orgeat, old vermouths, bitters that haven't been made for 120 years, and they could be made in Wellington and Auckland and Queenstown. And I think that's a really amazing. I'd by no means put it in the same league of scale of social change as things like Facebook and Trade Me, but it's certainly something very, very small that, in the same way, simply was not viable 20 years ago. Bartenders who started 15 years before me were still making drinks that have their heyday in the 1960s. And I was able to start making drinks that were both very forward-looking but also very backwards-looking, and it's simply thanks to a dial-up connection.